Dunque, a me il compito di aprire questo convegno di studi è incentrato sulla figura di Austen Henry Layard a 200 anni dalla nascita. Layard nacque nel 1817, in realtà siamo ormai nel 2018, ma questo convegno è stato pensato e costruito fondamentalmente nel 2017 e un piccolo slittamento sarà perdonato da tutti voi. Dunque un saluto innanzitutto a tutti voi che siete intervenuti a questo convegno. Sono molto contento io di aprirlo e di essere stato richiesto appunto di dire due parole di introduzione. Grazie ai colleghi relatori che sono qui oggi numerosi. Il convegno dura una giornata e mezzo, cioè oggi e fino a domani mattina. Grazie ai colleghi, alcuni dei quali che sono oggi in sala sono venuti da molto lontano e quindi li ringrazio con affetto anche per aver affrontato le difficoltà di trasporto e di viaggio di questi giorni. Grazie agli studenti intervenuti e a quanti sono interessati a questo straordinario personaggio di Layard, sul quale appunto ci soffermeremo a discutere e a parlare in questo giorno, in questa giornata e mezzo. Dunque, il convegno nasce dal lavoro, dall'iniziativa di due giovani ricercatrici che sono qui accanto a me e che vi presento. Una è Stefania Ermidoro, l'altra è Cecilia Riva, e a loro si deve non soltanto il lavoro organizzativo, ma sostanzialmente l'iniziativa e il lavoro scientifico che è alla base di queste due giornate. Stefania Ermidoro è una assiriologa e storica del Vicino Oriente Antico che si è dottorata a Foscari alcuni anni fa e che ha lavorato all'Università Cattolica di Leuven in questi ultimi anni, occupandosi in particolare del periodo neo-assiro e occupandosi molto di aspetti che agli assiriologi e anche agli storici non sono familiari, cioè problemi di cultura, di antropologia del Vicino Oriente. Quindi l'interesse per Layard e per la storia degli studi viene anche da questo. La dottoressa Cecilia Riva, una dottoranda del dottorato internazionale in storia delle arti di Ca' Foscari, Venezia, una storica dell'arte, e sono molto diciamo, io sono stato molto intrigato e molto affascinato dal taglio che ambedue hanno voluto dare a queste due giornate su Layard, cioè Layard non dal punto di vista solo dell'archeologia del Vicino Oriente, non dal punto di vista solo della nascita dell'assiriologia, non dal punto di vista solo delle curiosità, come dire, para-orientalistiche di Layard, cioè storia dell'arte, collezionismo, eccetera, ma cercando di individuare qual è la figura culturale, il retroterra, l'humus da cui nascono questi interessi congiunti, integrati di Layard. Quindi credo una prospettiva nuova che voi tutti saggerete durante queste due giornate. Dei ringraziamenti sono dovuti a chi ci ha prestato per questi due giorni una sede così bella che credo tutti apprezzerete, e non soltanto una sede così bella, anche direi gli strumenti per poter lavorare in questi mesi alla costruzione di questo convegno e per poterlo fare oggi. L'Istituto Veneto di Scienze, Lettere e Arti ha provveduto appunto al sostegno di carattere scientifico ancora prima che organizzativo per queste due giornate, e quindi gli siamo veramente grati per quello che ha fatto, e siamo grati anche al professor Gerardo Ortalli, presidente dell'istituto, che ha sostenuto e anzi si è compiaciuto di questa iniziativa. C'è qualche cosa di più che vorrei dire a proposito dell'Istituto Veneto. L'Istituto Veneto in questi ultimi anni ha dedicato particolare attenzione al Vicino Oriente Antico, ospitando mostre, una molto recente curata dal professor Fales su materiali della collezione Ligabue, altre due mostre stanno per essere inaugurate sullo stesso tema, L'Istituto Veneto ha anche ospitato conferenze che si occupano del vicino Oriente e quindi diciamo, c'è un, direi, nuovo, non tanto rinnovato, ma veramente nuovo interesse per questa disciplina di assiriologia, direi per i loro aspetti appunto integrati, per queste discipline e questo mi pare una cosa molto importante. Oltre all'Istituto Veneto desidero anche ringraziare, l'ho già fatto poco fa ma lo faccio di nuovo, il dottorato, l'ho menzionato, non l'ho fatto il ringraziamento, il dottorato internazionale in storia delle arti che diciamo, è un dottorato di Foscari che ha dato anche un suo sostegno finanziario attraverso la professoressa Martina Frank, che non è qui stamattina ma che credo interverrà nel prosieguo della giornata. Il gruppo interdisciplinare per la storia degli studi orientali, GRISSO, che è diretto da Silvia Alaura, che oggi è qui con noi, ha anche dato un sostegno e voglio sottolineare insomma, l'interesse di questa prospettiva proprio in un convegno che si occupa di Layard. Diciamo non c'è internazionalmente direi nessun gruppo di lavoro che specificatamente si sta occupando di storiografia della nostra disciplina, di storia degli studi. Ci sono naturalmente iniziative di singoli ricercatori, ma in questo caso che ci sia un gruppo di ricerca, cioè qualcosa di istituzionalizzato in questo senso, mi pare importante e credo che il lavoro di Stefania Ermidoro e di Cecilia Riva debba anche qualcosa a questo. Che altro dire a introduzione di questo convegno? Sono 200 anni dalla nascita di Layard, sono 170 anni dalla pubblicazione di Nineveh and its Remains, un'opera che appunto partorita nel 1848, fu pubblicata nel 1849 e tradotta in italiano integralmente nel 1855. Austeno Enrico Layard fu battezzato, insomma, il nostro Austen Henry Layard in questa traduzione che, dicevo, è del 1855 del conte Malvasia Tortorelli e insomma è molto significativo che l'Italia ebbe quasi da subito, insieme naturalmente ad altre traduzioni, un primo incontro insomma, con le famose scoperte di Ninive, per le quali Layard fu immediatamente molto famoso. Nel 1983, se non sbaglio, sì, perché poi il lavoro è stato pubblicato nell'87, già un primo convegno su Layard è stato ospitato a Venezia e io voglio ricordarlo perché credo che sia stato un importante convegno, i cui atti sono qui sul mio tavolo, Austen Henry Layard tra Oriente e Venezia. È un libro tra l'altro difficile da reperire, come ci siamo detti in questi giorni, un volume che fu pubblicato dall'ISMA di Brettschneider appunto 4 anni dopo il convegno, con un certo ritardo, ma che poi molto rapidamente è stato esaurito e quindi difficile da reperire. Ora, questo convegno sul Layard dell'83 fu un convegno fortunato, appunto, che si occupava essenzialmente dei rapporti tra attività di Layard con un occhio specifico alla cultura del tempo, ma anche alla città di Venezia. I rapporti tra Layard e Venezia sono noti a tutti, non soltanto Layard trascorse gli ultimi molti anni, 15 anni della sua vita a Venezia, a Palazzo Cappello, che forse si troverà anche il tempo di andare a visitare con quelli di voi che vogliono. È da molti anni una sede universitaria in pericolo, tra l'altro, perché c'è il rischio che Foscari lo venda, o insomma questa è la voce che è corsa negli anni scorsi e quindi siamo tutti attenti a che questa cosa non succeda. Dicevo, Layard passò a Venezia gli ultimi 15 anni della sua vita Passò in Italia molti anni della sua vita perché la sua giovinezza fu a Firenze, in Italia fece altri viaggi, naturalmente tra queste tappe italiane ci sono state le più importanti realizzazioni della sua vita, cioè essenzialmente l'archeologia orientale, in tutta l'area del Vicino Oriente, insomma, cioè tra l'Anatolia, la Siria settentrionale e soprattutto l'Iraq e la Siria, dove Nimrud e Ninive divennero anche suo campo specifico di azione. Il rapporto quindi tra Layard e Venezia è molto forte e che qui oggi si svolga il secondo convegno dopo quello dell'83 è una cosa di cui ci sentiamo, mi sento, ma si sentono soprattutto le due ricercatrici che sono accanto a me molto orgogliose, perché credo che sia un'iniziativa che non so se a caso o non a caso, insomma non è stata fatta altrove e che ci piace che sia oggi svolta a Venezia. Il tentativo di Stefania Ermidorio e Cecilia Riva, come vi dicevo, e con questo chiudo le mie parole di introduzione, è di dare un taglio diverso a questo convegno da quello che fu dato dal convegno dell'83, cioè sostanzialmente di trattare Layard non solo come colui che ha fondato l'archeologia del Vicino Oriente o ha contribuito in modo sostanziale a fondarlo, non solo come colui che ha pubblicato lavori fondamentali di archeologia, ma anche come figlio del suo tempo, cioè cercare di considerare Layard per un momento non soltanto come un archeologo, non soltanto come un politico o un diplomatico, ma anche come un uomo di cultura, un intellettuale del suo tempo, che va studiato in questi termini, e da qui appunto la collaborazione tra le due curatrici del convegno. Credo che questo basti, le introduzioni sono sempre una cosa che è troppo lunga, quindi qui vorrei fermarmi. Dicendovi che nel pomeriggio ci sarà qualche piccolo cambiamento nel programma che sarà annunciato più tardi, ma dicendovi anche che abbiamo una sorta di layered surprise, una sorpresa che riguarda Layard e Venezia, una sorpresa in termini di materiali. Voi sapete che a Venezia sono ospitati materiali che provengono da donazioni di Layard, dal Museo Archeologico Nazionale di Venezia, agli archivi di Stato. Bene, un collega mi ha detto di annunciare una layered surprise che alle 3 in punto tutti voi vedrete, saprete e conoscerete. Con questo finisco la mia introduzione e vorrei dare la parola al primo intervento della mattinata, che è quello di Andrew George, che ci parlerà di Layard of Nineveh and the Tablets of Nineveh. Prego.
Is that better? Yeah. I think I am going to stand and walk around, if that's all right. Can everyone hear? Yes, good, excellent. So what we want is the PowerPoint next. Please, if someone could work wonders with the imagery, then I can see what you're seeing at the same time. I'm an Assyriologist. That's to say I work with cuneiform tablets in London, and when I was invited to talk to a meeting which is concerned with Layard, I wondered what I was going to say, because I'm not a specialist in Layard studies, as it were. But then I thought, well, here's the man who provided Assyriology with its first great body of cuneiform tablets in 1850, as we shall see. So I think I'll talk about those tablets and where they were found and rethink Layard in that respect. Of course, is that going to work from here? Or, yes, correction, of course. Layard, as we all know, we'll see these portraits, no doubt, many times during these 2 days, was an empathetic character who, unlike, I think, many Victorian English gentlemen, was keen to fit in wherever he was, and hence these portraits in local dress, in Albanian dress on the right, and in Bakhtiari dress on the left. And I think his attitude to the people that he met on his travels, willingness to see them as his own equals and people that he wanted to fit in with as peers, explains his success during his first journey to the Middle East, which was when in 1839 he and another young man, Edward Mitford, set off from England with the intention of going to Ceylon overland, the hard way. And Mitford was going to farm coffee, and that's what he ended up doing, I think. But Layard had a view to going into legal practice in Ceylon because he was newly qualified as a solicitor, but London wasn't his scene at all. He was an outsider in London by virtue of education. Well, the pair arrived in the Middle East in 1840, and they went first to Aleppo, which you can see here. Let me see if I can work this. Oh, it's showing on the wall, so I'm not quite sure how that... Why? Anyway, you can see Aleppo there, and from Aleppo they went south to Jerusalem, where they parted because Layard, in typical style, wanted to go on a dangerous journey to Petra. He was advised not to. He went on it alone. Mitford said, "I'll meet you in Aleppo," and that's what happened. But Layard only just survived the journey to Petra. He was robbed and crawled back to Jerusalem with his life intact and just about the only thing that he had. He went up to Aleppo and met his friend again. They crossed to Mosul and then stayed a few days in Mosul, where he got bitten by a bug. He already, I think, by this time had malaria, which affected him on and off throughout the rest of his life. But he was bitten by a particular bug in Mosul, and that was the antiquities bug, as we'll see in a moment. The pair of them went by raft down from Mosul, down the Tigris to Baghdad, and then, wishing to move then further east towards Ceylon, they went over the Zagros Mountains to look at the site of Bisutun, where inscriptions of Darius had recently been partly deciphered by Henry Rawlinson. So the antiquities bug certainly dictated that journey. And at that point, Mitford said, let's press on now to Ceylon, and I'm going the safe way through northern Persia and down through Afghanistan. Layard typically said, I want to go the hard way, and I want to see the Bakhtiari tribes and the rock inscriptions of the lower Zagros down here. So they parted ways again, and that was the nearest that Layard got to Ceylon, of course, because he then spent a year at least, I think, in the Bakhtiari Mountains, having a great number of adventures, which resulted in him again running for his life and ending up in Basra, almost naked and with nothing to his person. At Basra he fell upon the British, of course, and he was sent up to Baghdad, where he impressed the resident Colonel Taylor with his knowledge of the political situation in the frontier between the Ottoman Empire and the Persian state, exactly where he had been in the Bakhtiari region. And Taylor said, I think you will be useful to the British government, your knowledge will be useful to the British government. Please go to Istanbul and brief the ambassador there. The ambassador was a man named Stratford Canning. So in 1842, Layard left Baghdad and went up overland this time to, not by raft, but by horse, to Mosul, where he stopped again briefly in the place which would become his archaeological home in the next few years, before then going up to Istanbul. And in Istanbul he introduced himself to Sir Stratford Canning. Canning found a job for him as a kind of political agent running errands for the British embassy. But At Mosul, during his first visit, Layard had met Paul Émile Botta, who was the French consul there, who had been sent out explicitly to investigate the ruin mounds of Assyria and dig them up. And this was an issue that attracted Layard very strongly, and so the two kept in touch. And while he was in Istanbul in 1843 and 1844, Layard learnt from Botta that Botta had found an Assyrian palace in a mound called Khorsabad, which is up here at the top of the map. He tried Nineveh, but without success. But at Khorsabad, he had found a palace, a monumental building, which turned out to be the palace of King Sargon II of Assyria. Layard was extremely jealous and asked Canning if he could go and excavate in Assyria. And Canning, motivated by that good old combination of patriotism and jealousy and chauvinism, thought that if the French were doing something in Assyria, the British should too, and they should, if possible, do it better than the French. That was these in the 19th century, of course. And so he agreed in the end to send Layard to Assyria to excavate one of the mounds, or several of the mounds. And so Layard in 1847, it was, I think, 1845, returned to Mosul. He then tried the mound of Kyunjik opposite Mosul, which is marked by this arrow pointing to Nineveh here. He didn't have much success, so he went down to Nimrud at the bottom of the map, where he quickly alighted upon another monumental palace, a palace that the English could call their own. It was better than the French one, of course, at Khorsabad, at least he thought so. At Nimrud, it turned out to be the palace of Ashurbanipal, an older building, older than Khorsabad. But at the end of this season, when the money was running out, he decided to go back to Mosul because the heat in Nimrud had become unbearable. And he put in a few weeks only, 5 weeks or 6 weeks of excavation in the mound of Kyunjik, which is opposite Mosul. And we should be able to see it here on this plan of Felix Jones of a few years later. In 1847, then, Layard started digging here, in this mound here, the mound of Kyunjik, which is the northernmost of the two citadel mounds of Nineveh. South of it, you can see the Nebi Yunus mound here, and the circuit of the city walls is clearly demonstrated on Jones's map. The region in this time looked a bit like this. We'll be seeing more of these wonderful watercolour sketches by Frederick Cooper from John Curtis later in the day. This is his sketch looking at Nineveh from the northeast in 1849, and you can see the wall crossing in the middle ground here, and beyond it the two citadel mounds of first Kyunjik and then Nebi Yunus, the tomb of the prophet Jonah, and across the river on the right here you can see Mosul. It looks like this in the 20th century. You can see the mound of Kyunjik there on the left, pitted with the pits left by archaeologists, and on the right, looking along the city wall up to the north, you can see Kyunjik in the northernmost citadel mound in the distance there, and that's just about the area where Layard dug, which was in the southwest corner of this citadel mound up here and there. And here's a plan of the citadel of Nineveh by Campbell Thompson in 1934, and I've ringed in red the southwest palace, which is essentially Austen Henry Layard's achievement of finding that palace there. So in we go. In the summer of 1846, Layard had tried Kyunjik and found nothing, and concentrated on Nimrud, as I said, further south, where he found the palace of Ashurbanipal. But when he came back, because of the heat and the lack of funds, to Mosul in May 1847 on his way home, he just had a couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, in which to excavate on Kyunjik, and that's what he found there. That plan comes from his first book, Nineveh and Its Remains, and what he'd found was the throne room suite of a great palace of an Assyrian king, who turned out to be Sennacherib, the son of Sargon of Khorsabad. and a king who ruled in the early 7th century BC. That's what it looks like today, or did look like in 1981. The area was re-excavated by King, I believe, in the early 20th century, and then again by Tariq Madloum for the Department of Antiquities of Iraq in the 1960s. And the throne room and its adjacent chambers were turned into a site museum, and you can see along the sides of the chambers there the stumps of the typical Assyrian monumental bas-relief orthostat slabs that line the walls of the palace, and a few pieces also of larger monumental sculpture. Just going back to this slide, you can see how carefully Layard has numbered each chamber, and around the walls of the chamber he's numbered each slab of limestone relief, which he documented in his notes. So that's the Nineveh Site Museum, and I guess that Layard must have left it a bit like that in 1847. He went home, money having run out, and discovered that the materials that he'd sent back from Nineveh had caused an absolute sensation, because here in the middle of Victorian England, at the end of the 1840s, was archaeological evidence of the Assyrian kingdom. And the Assyrians, of course, were so well known as the great hostile empire in the Old Testament, among them King Sennacherib, who laid siege to Jerusalem in 2 Kings, chapter 18. So what he'd found caused an absolute sensation, even though at that point very little of the inscriptions could be read, if anything at all. And this is where we come now to Layard and cuneiform tablets. He had the foresight, Layard. He knew that what he was looking at in terms of the inscriptions in cuneiform script on the monuments that he found in the throne room and its adjacent chambers, and of course to a great extent also in Nimrud, in the palace of the king who turned out to be Ashurbanipal II, that these were inscriptions and that they were therefore valuable, and he tried to copy them. And on the right you see the result of this first attempt by anyone to copy a large corpus of cuneiform inscriptions. He didn't know the script, and he didn't know the language. And in fact, no one did know the language at this point. This was 1850, before the decipherment of the language of the Assyrians, which we now call Akkadian. But he assembled this collection of inscriptions from his excavations, mostly at Nimrud, but also at Kyunjik. And some of these are usable today, typically where he's copying inscriptions that have been carved on monumental statuary, where there's no doubt about the nature of the sign of its, and its shape and so forth. And here, copied on from the forelegs of a monumental bull colossus, is an inscription of Shalmaneser, the son of Ashurnasirpal, the builder of the palace at Nimrud, which is perfectly legible today. But it wasn't always the case that cuneiform inscriptions could be read with ease, and it still is not the case. Here's a small clay tablet which Layard found at Nineveh in the southwest palace in the throne room suite, which we now know is a letter from a Babylonian to King Sin-shar-ishkun, the last king of the Syrian empire, towards 612 BC. And Layard's attempt at copying this is not successful. He's got hardly anything right, but that's not surprising because clay tablets are hard to copy at the best of times, and if you don't know what you're looking at and you can't read the language, then he's done pretty well, even though this hand copy is useless. But historically, very interesting to show that Layard, with his typical boldness and confidence, went into the business of copying clay tablets, convinced that this was useful. Layard then, having taken London by storm and being lionised by society, went back to his day job in Istanbul as the agent of Sir Stratford Canning. I think he had a promotion in between and was better treated on this occasion. But such was the clamour from London for more Assyrian antiquities that pressure was put on him to take a small sum of money from the British Museum, which was never enough, as he complained, and go back to Assyria for a second campaign. And this he did in September 1849, and he spent 18 months at Mosul and thereabouts conducting a second season, which was mostly concentrated on Kyunjik this time rather than Nimrud. And here's another watercolour by Cooper of Kyunjik from the southeast, looking across from the banks of the river Tigris, opposite Mosul, across the floodplain to the great mound in the distance, where you can see the workmen's camp on the left there, and on the right, I think these dark black blobs here are the spoil heaps of the palace of Sennacherib, the South Palace. In the interval, further excavation had continued while in his absence, with his friend Henry Ross taking over for a while, and then the local vice-consul, Christian Razam, an Assyrian Christian, also supervising the workmen under their foreman, who is called Toma the Fat, Toma Shishman, who's rather a character. He once was asked to travel from Nimrud to Nineveh on a donkey, and the donkey collapsed halfway through the journey because Toma Shishman was so fat that the donkey couldn't carry him. Anyway, under Toma Shishman, the workmen had continued to excavate, and they found a new technique, which was, instead of laying bare each chamber under this enormous top deposition of stuff from the decayed palace, but also from whatever lay on top of the decayed palace, which didn't interest Victorian archaeologists at all, the new technique was to tunnel, following the reliefs and the limestone slabs at the sides of the walls, along the corridors, around the courts and into chambers. Tunnelling proved to be an effective way of recovering the ground plan of this great palace. On the left you see a rather organized picture. Cooper has given us this watercolor sketch of local natives in a corridor, and you can see the slabs on either side, and some boulders also must have fallen down from above. But on the right, a very much more jumbled picture of Gallery 49, with a slab lying at strange angle on the left, and a lion man who shouldn't be there at all. He's not in the right place on the right. Some of this material was recovered and sent back to the museum. So, for example, this lion man is here now in the is in London in the British Museum, drawn on the left by Layard. He did a lot of drawing himself, and on the right the photograph from Barnett's sculptures of the Southwest Palace. Layard's excavations then at Nineveh produced this ground plan of this large Neo-Assyrian palace, the palace that turned out to be a palace of Sennacherib, king of Assyria in the early 7th century BC. And we have, I should just go back and say that this sketch on the right is by the vicar of a rural parish from Dorset in England, who was an extraordinary man. He was born Swiss. He was a great Orientalist, and he came out visiting Gyunjik for 10 days only in June in 1850, and made a wonderful series of paintings, watercolor sketches. Solomon Malon, his name is. And here on the right is Solomon Lamont's pencil sketch of Layard drawing, and it's so careful that you can see the reliefs that he's drawing there on the left of the picture. A river full of fish, men walking above in the register above, and a horse, and at the bottom some vague outlines of buildings. And thanks to Layard's drawings, you can see him there drawing, making his drawing, and the drawing actually survives. And it survives as slabs that come from this facade here at the south corner of south end of Court 19. And here are Layard's drawings of those two slabs, slab 15 and 16, with the fish in the river, the men walking across the top register. The buildings at the bottom turn out to be a Babylonian town under siege from the Assyrian army, and the king, the horse, turns out to be drawing the chariot of the king of Assyria, who was in fact Ashurbanipal, not Sennacherib. This is a redecoration of this courtyard by Sennacherib's grandson Ashurbanipal, who reigned in the mid-7th century BC. This suite of rooms was uncovered just as Layard returned from an adventure. He went off to the Khabur river basin in the North Jazeera, west of Mosul, for some weeks in the spring of 1850 to look at the remains in Tel Arban. And he returned in May or June to find that his workmen had continued in his absence, of course, and had uncovered two extraordinary things at Nineveh. They'd also made extraordinary discoveries at Nimrud, but that's another story. At Nineveh, they had discovered this suite of rooms here that you can see outlined in red. And what's noticeable about this suite of rooms is you've got this access through them from courtyard H through through one chamber, second chamber, and a third chamber, all guarded by winged bulls, which are those those parallel features that you can see either side of those monumental gateways through along the axis into that set of chambers, leading from 29 to 34 to 36. And clearly the focus there is on 36, and particularly on the reliefs on the back wall. And if you see, the reliefs are numbered from slabs 1 to 13 in that typical thorough manner of Layard. The bulls either side would have looked like this: the bull colossi, human-headed, bull-feeted colossi, but also human-headed, lion-footed colossi that guard Assyrian monumental doorways in other palaces, for example at Nimrud. And here we've got Nimrud bulls in New York and in London, and a Nineveh bull on one of the reconstructed gates of Nineveh, the one I think that was attacked by a gentleman who was working for ISIS and had a pneumatic drill, and I'm afraid damaged the bull rather considerably. And on the right, a lithograph from the Illustrated London News depicting Victorians admiring the bulls of Nimrud in London. Those are the figures that guarded the entrance H to this suite of rooms, leading to room 36 with its reliefs that we'll come to in a moment. And Malon, while he was there, was fascinated by this entrance, and he gives us two paintings of it. And you can see on the left here the four legs of the winged bull, Colossus. Then behind, after the entranceway, you can see another bull Colossus, and beyond that, an apotropaic figure guarding the entrance with his bucket with holy water in it, and beyond that, slabs leading away down the facade of courtyard 19 into the distance. And on the right, you can see the same view from the other side, where you can see one of the colossi here and another one there. So the entrance is here. There's the apotropaic figure of the other side of the doorway, and slab 12 here has a continuation of the scene that we saw with Ashurbanipal's siege of a Babylonian city with the river full of fish. The interesting thing about this one is that it's the only publication of it. This is all black here in Barnett's sculptures of the Southwest Palace. It may be because of the scan I've seen of it has ruined the image, but I think it's one of the beauties of modern technology is you can put the image into Photoshop and lighten the shadows. And I was a bit surprised to see that the pool of black in the middle that just seemed to be shadow, actually, if you lighten the shadows, you can see rather clearly the counterpart figure to this one here, lit up by a shaft of light from above, is actually in this shadow, with the arm carrying the bucket and the other arm raised with the sprinkler. And that indeed is the figure that was drawn by Layard on the left, and we can replicate it on the right as the slab 13 that was never drawn. That's the one in sunshine. Slab 14 is the one in shade in Layard's drawings. Let's go through that archway H and carry on past the second set of bull colossi and the third set, and we come to this chamber 36 with its reliefs. And right opposite you, as you go into that chamber, is this scene, drawn by Layard, I think, showing a siege of a town on a hill, which is now identified as the siege of Lachish, a place, a city in what is now Israel. And all the slabs in this little room told the story of the siege of Lachish by the Assyrian army, and ended with this one just inside the door on the right, which shows King Sennacherib reviewing the results. And there's a little epigraph up there you can see in cuneiform writing, which Layard, of course, couldn't read in 1849, 1850 it was, 1850. In fact, no one could read it, but such was the advance of decipherment that after Layard's return from Nineveh, Hincks, who was one of the pioneer decipherers of Akkadian, the language of the Assyrians, was able to offer the following translation of this epigraph to Layard so that he could publish it in his second book about excavations, Monuments Discovered in Nineveh and Babylon, in 1853. And Hinks's translation goes as follows. He knows the name of the king by now, Sennacherib, the mighty king, king of the country of Assyria, sitting on the throne of judgment before, or at the entrance of, the city of Lachish. I give permission for its slaughter. Now, what's in blue there is actually wrong, because, as I say, the decipherment didn't really definitively happen until it was proved in 1857. The 1850s were the great decade of the breakthrough of cuneiform script on the one hand, and also the language that they wrote on the other. So that we would now read, with the benefit of 150 years of Assyriology under our belts, this epigraph as Sennacherib, king of the world, king of the land of Assyria, sat on a high-backed throne, and the booty of the city Lachisu passed before him. So he's reviewing the booty of Lachish. This, of course, caused in 1853 a great second uproar in London, as people realized, and in Europe, of course, people realized that here was a corroboration of the history told in the Bible of King Hezekiah, how Sennacherib had taken Lachish and had sent his envoy to Jerusalem to demand the surrender of the king of Judah, Hezekiah, in 2 Kings 18. Here was a corroboration of that. But of course, at a time when the Bible was under suspicion of being wholly made up, to get corroboration from an independent historical source was a marvellous thing. So the British Museum sent a message to Mosul, to the man who had continued the excavations, Hormuz Rassam, and said, please go back to this chamber and get out all the slabs and send them to us. And so indeed, Hormuz Rassam did. The slabs are now in the Assyrian basement of the British Museum. Beautiful and impressive monuments of Assyrian art. Also in this suite of rooms, we come now to the chambers of records that, as Layard returned from his picnic party, as it's been called, to Tel Arban in the Jazeera in June 1850, he found that his workmen had uncovered also these ancillary rooms off to the right of the Lachish suite, including 2 chambers, 40 and 41, in which were found, to the depth of a foot or more, cuneiform tablets lying on the floor. Here's Malon's sketch. He happened to be on, it was a good thing, he happened to be on the scene, and he sketched it on the left in this watercolour sketch. And this was later reproduced as a lithograph for Layard's second book, The Monuments of Nineveh and Babylon, but you notice some changes have taken place. First of all, the reliefs that go round the room have been somehow completed. This straight line here, it doesn't exist on the original, as you can see. That the fallen masonry has been tidied up, particularly at the front here, where you've got some slabs that have been mistaken for a threshold. They're not at all, they're just jumbled slabs. And a major innovation here is that the figure of the Arab, who's the local native, who's put there for scale, has metamorphosed into Layard himself. That picture that we earlier saw of Layard facing left and drawing the slabs of the facade of Court 19, that figure reappears in this lithograph here, made by John Murray, made for the publisher John Murray by Nicholas Chevalier. And here it is, just to remind you, that was what we saw earlier from Court 19, the reverse figure, and there's Chevalier, the culprit, who introduced the figure of Layard into a sketch where he wasn't originally. In fact, we haven't got any of Layard's drawings from room 41 for good reason. He was never there drawing, despite the lithograph which suggests that he was. In this room, and apparently both rooms, was this jumble of tablets lying on the floor, and they must have looked something like the ones on the left, which are from an earlier period in a different place, but nevertheless clay tablets, you see, when they fall, break into lots of little bits. And on the right you see one of the tablets that came from this room, certainly, It has a low K number, which is indicative of the Southwest Palace, according to Julian Reed, who has studied these things. And it has on it a label. It's a manuscript of the tablet 6 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the masterpieces of Babylonian poetry. It has on a label saying this is the property of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria. Ashurbanipal, remember, is the grandson of the king Sennacherib, who's associated with the Southwest Palace and built it. And so we get this rather misleading title given to this body of material, these tablets, called the Library of King Ashurbanipal. In fact, they're the Assyrian Royal Archives and Library, going back for several reigns beyond Ashurbanipal. And they're fragmentary, so the work of Assyriology, which I'm engaged in, and my colleagues, is partly involved with rebuilding these fragments into tablets. And you can see here two photographs on the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative website of the work so far, with 5 pieces joined on the left to form a manuscript of Enki and Ninmach, and on the right 13K pieces joined to form a manuscript of what we call Sin Idinam's letter. So Layard's achievements at Nineveh in this period, specifically Nineveh, and when he first excavated, he thought Nimrud was Nineveh, but by the time of his second expedition, he knew that Nimrud was not Nineveh, as the decipherment had indicated that this was a place called Kalchu. Nineveh itself was the great city opposite Mosul, with its 2 citadel mounds of Kyunjik and Nebi Yunus. And his achievements there had been to find the plan of a great Neo-Assyrian palace, as we saw, to find about 3 kilometers of walls, many of them decorated with those limestone slabs sculpted in bas-reliefs with depictions of the army conquering enemies. And then this third achievement, to find 15,000 tablets or more, which enabled the breakthrough in decipherment of the Assyrian language, which revealed in turn the written culture of ancient Mesopotamia, which Assyriologists are still recovering, and created very much at home in the British Museum a desire for more. Because what happened with these tablets is that the British Museum appointed a young man called George Smith to sort them eventually in 1866, after they'd been lying for 15 years, without really much anyone being able to do anything with them. And George Smith began to reconstruct individual texts from different manuscripts present in the Kyunjik collection from the archive chambers that I've just shown you. Among them these 3 tablets of the flood, tablet 11 of Gilgamesh, which caused such a storm in 1872 that the Daily Telegraph paid for Smith to go out and find the missing bits, because as you can see these are fragmentary, these cuneiform tablets. That photograph taken in 1873. So that what happens after Layard left Kyunjik and left his palace is that other people are involved in the excavation. Ross and Christian Rassam in 1847 we've heard about, but then Hormuzd and Christian Rassam, after Layard finally left after his second expedition in 1852, carried on for a few years and found more tablets in the North Palace on Kyunjik. And then Smith, George Smith, the young Assyriologist who discovered the flood tablets, came in 1873 and 1874. Hormuzd Rassam returned 30 years after Layard first went to Kyunjik and carried on excavation, and then further agents of the British Museum to 1932, with the result that we've got something like 32,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments from Kyunjik. But it's a hopeless mess as a body of material, because there's very, very little archaeological evidence to suggest where on Kyunjik, and indeed in Nineveh as a whole, individual fragments and tablets come from. So we're not completely sure what Layard found and what other people found. The rebuilding process of tablets goes on, utilizing not only the Kyunjik fragments, but also fragments found by these later excavators, Rassam and Smith in particular. 2 examples there. What is the content of this collection? Well, we've got archival texts, which are the ephemeral texts of the administration, including letters, legal texts. They're not ephemera, but the administrative texts are. And then texts relating to oracle questions, queries of the gods, and then reports of scholars observing the skies and so forth. This accounts for about 16% of the Kyunjik collection, 32,000 tablets. And the rest are royal and literary texts. By literary texts we mean liturgical and religious texts, exorcist law, divination literature, which seems to be about 40% of the whole, a vast quantity of omen stuff, astrological texts, mathematical texts, technical literature, pedagogical texts, poetry and belles lettres, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, but also the creation epic and so forth, and folk literature. That gives you about 84% of the whole. So you've got both archival texts and texts from the Babylonian stream of tradition, copied out in Nineveh, and royal texts as well. Obviously, this is a palace, so you'd expect that. Dating them is only possible so far as the dated archival texts are concerned, and one very important fact emerges here. First of all, you can see that we've got about a quarter of the collection found on Nineveh, and chiefly at least 50% in the archive chambers of the Palace of Sennacherib, actually relate to the activities of the administration of his father, Sargon II, who was the king who built the palace at Khorsabad, excavated by Botta. So part of the archive of Sargon ends up in this chamber next to the Lachish Suite in Southwest Palace of Sennacherib at Nineveh. And the other thing is about 50% are from Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, his son, and the early reign of Ashurbanipal, his grandson. And this seems to be also true of the literary texts, that most tablets are from the time of Ashurbanipal, but there are older tablets, both written for the royal library, but also requisitioned from the libraries of private scholars from Kalkhu, Nimrud. And there's nothing explicitly later than Ashurbanipal, so we've got a situation in which you've got a body of tablets, cuneiform tablets, archival and literary, and they're all ancient. It's all old stuff, because Nineveh fell in 612 BC. And what we've got from the last 30 years of the Assyrian kingdom is very little. At the very most 19%, but that includes a very great deal of undated material, which is probably older than 30 years. So this is a dead archive. As an archive goes, it's not the archive that was current when the Medes and Babylonians sacked Nineveh in 612 BC. Those tablets haven't been discovered. And it looks as if the literary texts also are old, going back to Ashurbanipal probably before 645. Revisiting the chambers of records and asking what are they, in fact, we discover that this layout of two chambers, an antechamber and then within it isolated another chamber with a niche, is replicated several times in this palace. In David Kertai's plan, you can see in brown these chambers with niches often reached beyond an antechamber, but not always. And where excavators have been back to these chambers, they have found, at least in room 4, at the top there, at the throne room suite, the drainage channels. So it does now appear from looking at the palace as a whole, but also looking at other Assyrian palaces, that these little niched chambers, sometimes set beyond antechambers, are in fact bathrooms. So Ashurbanipal's library, which isn't Ashurbanipal's library, is found in a chamber of records which is not a chamber of records. It's a bathroom, and the antechamber of the bathroom. So those are the problems that we were left with. These bathrooms, incidentally, were all guarded by these fierce-looking figures, because when you go into the bathroom and you lift the plug of the drain, the first thing that happens is that a demon wants to rise up and bite you on the bottom. So you have to have the protection of exorcistic or apotropaic figures, and as you go in through the doorways, this is what you meet, a lion-headed man, much like the one we saw earlier out of place in that corridor, drawn by Solomon Malon, but also a smiting god who's identified as Lulal. And these, as you go past them, will protect you and be alongside you as you squat over the drain or as you wash yourself in the drain. So here are the problems then. The tablets aren't contemporary with the palace's destruction, and the rooms 40 and 41 are not archive rooms. So the question we have to ask, and this is where I'm doing some rethinking, and the only place I think where I'm doing any rethinking, is how did these old tablets end up in this bathroom and its antechamber? Well, it's an archaeological problem then, which has absorbed minds ever since Layard, and Layard thought that it had fallen, this stuff had fallen down from an upper story. Not because he knew that it was in a bathroom. He thought that because of their broken state, they might be from an upper story, but he also thought that somehow the decoration of the doorways was appropriate to an archive chamber, which we won't go into. So he had rather confused thinking there. Smith, who came in 1873 to work through the old diggings of Layard, found that he actually discovered 3,000 tablets, and he found them fragmentary, some in the archive chambers of Layard, but some in adjacent rooms which had no communication. And so he assumed that this was because they'd fallen down from the roof above. The positions and distribution of the fragments, he said, suggests that the library was in the upper story of the palace, and that as the tablets fell, they fell into different chambers. But actually, this seems to be rather unlikely, because if you look at the great walls of the chambers there, you'll see that if they supported a second story at all, they would have continued up, so that anything falling down from above in the second story would have remained within the same walls and fallen directly down into the chamber below. What wouldn't have happened is that tablets would have crossed from above here to above there. This is a long gallery that is now considered to be an open corridor in which Smith found fragments that joined fragments from the other side of the wall. And David Curtai thinks he's the modern expert on the architecture of the Southwest Palace. He thinks the second story is unlikely per se, but he also says it seems highly implausible for parts of a single object to end up in two rooms by falling down from above, as this would entail one part of the object overcoming the presence of walls separating the rooms, and I rather agree with him that this seems to me highly improbable. Another answer given by Curtai, but also by Geoffrey Turner, another expert in the architecture of the Southwest Palace, is that the bathrooms 40 and 41 were converted into archive storage in the mid to late 7th century BC. So that what happened is that the administration got fed up with all these old tablets and looking for an available space in the palace where to dump them, they took them all the way inside the palace to that suite of rooms and thought that they could dump them there in the antechamber of the bathroom and probably in the bathroom itself, which is possible. Another idea, and this is a little bit of rethinking, is that the tablets were not dumped there by Assyrians at all, but were dumped there by Babylonians. Because what happens is that the Babylonians and the Medes sacked Nineveh in 612 BC and put an end to the Assyrian state. And of course, the Babylonian Mukhabarat, the intelligence service, would have been interested in who the Assyrians had been talking to politically. They had espionage in those days, of course, and they had intelligence services. So the Babylonian intelligence service, in this hypothesis, sorted through the tablets that they found in the palaces of Nineveh, and they dumped the ones they didn't want, and they took the important ones, the ones with information, away to a different place where they mined them for intelligence. There is a comparable situation from 1750 BC, when the old Babylonian king Hammurabi sent his agents to Mari, which his army had just taken, to sort through their collections, the palace archives there, and we have the dockets on the baskets of tablets which demonstrate that Hammurabi's agents had sorted the tablets of Mari after its conquest, which they can only have done because they were interested in extracting political and military information about the alliances that Mari had formed and who were the culprits after individuals as well, I would guess. So the possibility is that something similar happened in 612 BC in Nineveh. But there's another possibility, let me just, before we do that, say that perhaps with this theory as well as the previous one, there's a slight improbability because from comparable evidence, from comparative evidence, where we expect the current archives of the Southwest Palace to be is in the forecourts of the palace. You see there's the throne room that they had first excavated in 1847 is there, and the archive rooms that he thought he'd found, which actually turned out to be bathrooms, were here. But in front of the throne room were these two great courtyards, and almost certainly that's where the civil service had their offices, and if there are going to be archives involved with the administration of the state, that's where they should be, but they remain unexcavated. So it seems a big ask to suggest that tablets were taken from here all the way into there for dumping, when they could have just been, well, thrown over the side of the till. But there's another idea here which I put to you, which is that the tablets were actually rubbish. Because, as you've seen, they were old, dead archives and old copies of literary texts that perhaps no one was interested in anymore. Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal were intellectuals, Sennacherib's son and grandson. They were intellectuals. They were interested in Babylonian literature. They were interested in the professional literature that would help them to reign as the gods intended. But we don't know that the later kings were at all interested, and it may be they didn't need this stuff at all. So the idea here is that the tablets were considered rubbish, and they were placed in rooms 40 and 41, not as a dump, but as the substructure of a new floor, perhaps never completed. And the clue here is that Layard says that when he found the tablets, the floor of the two chambers was entirely filled with tablets to the height of a foot or more. So that seems not to suggest a big dump of tablets in a pile, but actually a careful distribution, a level distribution of tablets throughout the chamber, or chambers if both rooms were filled with them. And that calls to mind those many, many archaeological instances in the Near East of cuneiform tablets being used as fill in the creation of new floors. When you raise a floor, you need material to do that with, and clay tablets are wonderful because they're flat and hard, not unbreakably hard, but they're fairly solid things. And if you lay them out, then you get a good substructure for a floor. So I'm wondering whether, in fact, these tablets were deliberately placed in rooms 40 to 41 as the substructure of a new floor. The question would then arise, who did this? Was it an Assyrian king after Ashurbanipal who didn't need this bathroom, and there was another one just across the court, and so thought, well, I'll reuse this room and I'll put a new floor down before I do that, and here are some old tablets with which I will build the floor up a bit? Or was it, in fact, later, after the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC, this broken palace, which had been burnt by the Medes and Babylonians, was, to some extent, an occupiable building, I feel, and there may have been local people, refugees, perhaps displaced from the lower town, needing a more secure place to live, who entered the palace to set up temporary or extemporary residences there and dwelt for a time in the chambers of the palace. And perhaps they didn't want a bathroom. Maybe they didn't know what bathrooms were for. They were townsmen or peasants, and they didn't need bathrooms, so they found all these old tablets and just scattered them over the floor in order to make a new one. That then is a second hypothesis, that it wasn't an Assyrian king who put the tablets in that chamber at all, but someone who lived after the fall of the Assyrian Empire and wanted to make this particular chamber in the broken palace habitable. And that's where I stop. I think I've done a little bit of rethinking, but I haven't actually got any answers for you as a result of that thinking. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this lecture. I am afraid we don't have time now to discuss this paper, but we will do it at the end of this morning. No, I think it's a good idea to discuss probably all the papers of this morning at the end. By the way, what you said now at the end of your paper is really interesting. It reminds me of what we found in Tel Beider, which means the subfloor of partially in the palace and partially in the housing in the house sector of the city, a subfloor made up of tablets. I mean, fragments of tablets, etc. It could be, yes. Speaking of rethinking, this is a very good idea. Yes. So the next paper is by Silvia Alaura, Austen Henry Layard and Archibald Henry Sayce, an Anatolian perspective.
Buongiorno a tutti, e prima di iniziare desidero ringraziare gli organizzatori di questo convegno, Lucio Milano, Stefania Ermidoro e Cecilia Riva, e naturalmente anche un ringraziamento speciale all'Istituto Veneto per averci ospitato in questa splendida sede. Grazie. Present one of the less known and most under-investigated aspects of the multifaceted life and career of Austen Henry Layard is undoubtedly his role in the history of the pre-classical archaeology of Anatolia, which primarily dates back to the period when he was British ambassador at Constantinople, that is from April 1877 to May 1880. Actually, such a role does not emerge from Layard's memoirs of his ambassadorship to Turkey, which, together with the diaries of Lady Layard for the same period, are the primary sources for the study of these 3 momentous years. Both the museum and the diaries are kept in the Western Manuscript Department of the British Library in London and have been fully published in recent years. This role is not even apparent from Layard's unpublished diplomatic correspondence from the same period, such as that with Lord Beaconsfield, which I have recently examined in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. Rather, Layard's involvement in this formative phase of Anatolian research is documented in his contacts with the Anglican clergyman Archibald Henry Sayce, a younger scholar who at the end of the 1870s was focusing his studies on the Hittites in Asia Minor. Shortly afterwards, Sayce became professor of comparative philology and later of Assyriology at Oxford. Together with his lifelong friend Friedrich Max Müller, the Oxford-based German comparative philologist, and the sinologist James Legge, Sayce was dubbed one of the 3 Eastern sages of Oxford scholarship. The relationship between Layard and Sayce, on which my paper focuses, has not so far been adequately investigated. This is mainly to be attributed to the fact that Sayce, unlike Layard, has until now been largely ignored by historians and academics or viewed with increasing criticism and even disdain. Indeed, although a residual appreciation of the value of his work has remained in some areas in which he published, most of the agenda behind Sayce's work has lost its relevance and simply no longer fit in with prevailing scholarly interests. However, I believe that Sayce's prominence as a public intellectual and his copious correspondence with leading contemporary scholars and cultural figures for most of his long life placed him in the thick of that intense network that formed the backbone of a Victorian establishment. The document I present to you today, almost all unpublished, are preserved together with many others in archives in Oxford and in the British Library in London. These materials enrich our picture of collaboration and connections between the founders of what would subsequently become the various specialized disciplines of ancient Near Eastern studies, thus helping to shed light on the intellectual complexity and the practices and methods of the Orientalists in the mid-Victorian era. In this way, I hope with my paper to extend our evaluation of Layard's contribution to include subjects not examined before. Layard was among the scholars who exercised the greatest influence upon Sayce's formative years, As Sayce describes in his memoirs, as a schoolboy he began to study cuneiform by analyzing the list of personal and geographical names in Layard's Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon, published in 1853. This aspect, that of Layard the Assyriologist, has long been underestimated, as shown by Stefania Ermidoro in a paper she gave at last summer's Rencontre Assyriologie Internationale held in Marburg. And today, also Andrew George devoted a part of his really interesting paper to this topic. Years later, Layard was one of the highly significant persons Sayce met in London at the Athenaeum Club. The Athenaeum Club at Pall Mall, south of Burlington House, was particularly popular among the scientific and literary elite and was one of the places of meeting and discussion for the Orientalists of the 1870s, in which the initial debate about the Hittites developed. The Orientalists were members of a smaller dining club within the Athenaeum that included, besides Layard, Henry Rawlinson, James Ferguson, the architect and art historian specializing in ancient Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Indian art, and also manager of the Crystal Palace Company. And William Sandy Wright Vaux, who from November 1875 until his death was secretary of the Royal Asiatic Society, and whose publication did much to popularize the Oriental antiquities discovered by Layard. Their dinners, which took place at 7 o'clock on Sunday evening at the Athenaeum Club, are described in abundant detail by Sayce in his aforementioned autobiography. It is in this context, in this club known as a neutral and peaceful refuge where bustle and excitement are unknown, that Sayce probably discussed in a preliminary way the idea that the inscriptions from both Syria and Anatolia should be attributed to the Hittites. Actually, during the 1870s, the debate about the Hittites was conducted in a widespread and dynamic way. Every space in London where the learned met and mingled could serve as a stage upon which Orientalists showed each other the progress they had made in their research, testing out their new ideas. Public spaces could double as places of learning. Yet a range of humbler, everyday interactions also played a crucial role in the progress of Oriental studies. The year 1879 marked a turning point for Sayce. In a lecture given at the Athenaeum on August 4th, then published in the weekly periodical The Academy, Sayce proposed that all the monuments with associated hieroglyphic inscriptions from Syria and Anatolia, among which the famous Caravelle relief drawn year before by Charles Texier, should be attributed to the Hittites. Sayce himself described these as my Hittite theory of 1879. A few days after this Athenaeum lecture, Sayce began the first of his travels through the East in order to gain first-hand knowledge of Western Anatolia. To that end, Sayce turned to Layard. Sayce's appreciation of Layard as ambassadors shine out in this passage from his autobiography. The opinion of Sayce on Layard was not shared by everyone in England. Layard's credibility as a diplomat was called into question, especially by Gladstone's faction, as evident from this illustration published in the Punch on March 2, 1878, where Layard is shown plowing into an Eastern-looking china shop, knocking over vases with labels such as caution and diplomatic propriety. Preserved at Queen's College, Oxford, there is a letter from Arthur Nicholson, the well-known British diplomat and politician, then second secretary at the embassy at Constantinople, which at the beginning of September 1879 confirmed to Sayce that Layard would be available to meet him at the summer residence of the British embassy at Therapia. Sayce used the back of this letter to make notes during the journey, and it contains his first impressions of his visit to the monumental Caravelle relief, written in pencil but still legible. Incidentally, this is not the only example we have of Sayce reusing letters, hotel receipts, and tickets to make his painstaking drawings and notes during his travels. Such documents are doubly interesting, even if they are often hard to decipher. And here you have a number of examples. The large state dinner party held on the evening of Sayce's arrival at the embassy at Therapia, attended by most of the Turkish ministers and leading European diplomats, is briefly mentioned in the diaries of Lady Layard. However, it is described in detail by Sayce in his memoirs in a passage that justifies what Stephen Langdon would write years later in his obituary of Sayce. A raconteur of delightful tales, he possesses a mild humor which is rare in our day. Of particular interest is the account of a long conversation that Sayce had with Layard, during which the latter recalled a youthful adventure that took place immediately before his excavations in Assyria, when Sir Stratford Canning, the British ambassador, employed him in various unofficial diplomatic missions in Turkey. And this episode does not feature either in Layard's autobiography or in his early adventures. This episode is also mentioned in a lengthy unpublished manuscript written by Sayce entitled The Heroic Age of Assyriology, kept at Queen's College, Oxford, and currently being studied by myself and Marco Bonecchi. Layard supported Sayce's stay in Anatolia in many ways. First of all, Sayce was allowed to examine archaeological and epigraphic finds of the Imperial Museum in Constantinople, newly transferred to chinili kiosks and steel in crates. His account of his visit to the museum, in which he thanked Layard, was immediately sent by Sayce to the aforementioned periodical The Academy. Layard then personally introduced Sayce to the Sultan in order to facilitate his access to the Anatolian monuments. It is interesting to note that it is just in this day that the British governor, via his ambassador Layard, was exerting strong pressure on the Sultan to make political reforms, as we see from this illustration in Punch, the liberal and politically active publication that mirrored the Victorian public's mood for liberal social changes. It was drawn by the satirical cartoonist John Tenniel, whose fame stems primarily from his drawings for Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Layard himself, together with his wife and her niece, was to leave Therapia a few days later to visit the coast of Asia Minor, Syria, and some of the Turkish islands, in order to judge for himself the condition of the Asiatic provinces and to have personal communication with both British consular officers and Turkish authorities. Although for different reasons at this time, Layard and Sayce, therefore, had a shared interest in the Mediterranean region of the Ottoman Empire. Sayce's trip to Western Asia Minor focused on four main areas of ancient Lydia, that is Smyrna and his neighborhood, including the Karabel Pass and Akpinar, Sardis and its neighborhood, including the Aliates Tumulus, the Marmara Lake, and the Gumushda, then Ephesus and Magnesia, and the Troad. And here you can see the Karabel Pass and Akpinar, one of the main goals of Sayce's trip, with the description of the monuments given by Herodotus and Pausanias. Sayce's interest in the Troad comes as no surprise, because he was one of the first to recognize the importance of Heinrich Schliemann's discoveries at Hissarlik for the preclassical civilization of Greece and Anatolia. Schliemann, who in the mid-1870s was lauded and derided in equal measure, fascinated Sayce as much as George Smith had. Sayce also contributed to Schliemann's book, and particularly he wrote the preface of Schliemann's Troia. Layard fostered Sayce's friendship with Schliemann, even if the British ambassador was among those unconvinced that Hissarlik was to be identified with Troy. Layard's disappointment at Hissarlik's ruins is palpable in a long passage from his memoirs referring to a trip he had made in 1877 along the coast of Asia Minor. We might ask ourselves what Layard made of the fact that Schliemann's discoveries in Anatolia were being compared with those he himself had carried out in Assyria. Promising material proof of the Homeric poems, Schliemann's excavation at Hissarlik were equated in the public mind with Layard's excavations in Mesopotamia with regard to the Bible. The numerous letters exchanged by Sayce and Schliemann, an example of which we see here, are kept in the Bodleian Library, Schliemann's letters being easily recognizable by their blue paper and pointy handwriting. They are currently being studied, and together with the Layard-Schliemann correspondence kept in the British Museum, will perhaps reveal further detail about the archaeology of Western Asia Minor in these years. On his return to England, Sayce expressed his gratitude to Layard in a letter dated November 1879, now kept in the Layard papers again in the British Library. And I wish to thank Cecilia Riva for kindly making available me the transcription of this letter some months ago. The letter shows how Sayce called upon Layard for archaeological advice, suggesting an excavation at Cume. This proposal was part of Sayce's extensive research program in Asia Minor to further promote the study of Hittite culture in order to give Britain a monopoly on Hittite research. This program began life within the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies, recently founded by Sayce together with Sir Charles Thomas Newton, known for the discovery of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, and at that time keeper of Greek and Roman antiquities at the British Museum. The two scholars had become very intimate at the end of 1878, following the publication of two articles by Sayce, in which he had suggested that, I quote, Assyrian influence entered Greece through Asia Minor, and that, I quote again, before the appearance of the Phoenicians, the Phrygians had become the intermediaries between East and West. The objectives of the society included that of founding a British school at Smyrna to compete with those of the French and Germans in Athens. Sayce himself was to recall the aims of his travels, as you can see here. My exploratory travels in Asia Minor were intended to be a sort of introductory essay in what we hoped would form a large part of the future work of the society, and so on. Although Layard had retired from archaeological practice many years before, as ambassador, he was very active in promoting British excavation in the Near East, as shown by his recent support for both Hormuz Rassam's expeditions in Mesopotamia and Patrick Henderson's expedition at Carchemish, both on behalf of the British Museum. Other details of the travel undertaken by Sayce had already been communicated to Layard from England by Newton in a letter dated November 5, 1879, an extract of from which I have for you here. As we can see in his letter, Newton focuses on those aspects he has identified in Sayce's account of his travels that concern the interests and strategies of the British Museum. Layard's reply to Sayce's letter, dated December 12 of the same year, is preserved at the Bodleian Library. And here you have the transcription of his letter. From it we learn that Sayce's idea to excavate at Cumae was one he shared with a British explorer and Etruscologist George Dennis, who, being a protege of Layard, at the time worked at the Smyrna consulate, and also that the project came to nothing because the British were preempted by the Americans. Sometimes later, in 1882, Dennis led an archaeological campaign at Sardis. For Sayce and his many projects in Anatolia, from the establishment of a school at Smyrna to the excavations at Cumae, the end of Layard's posting to Constantinople in 1880 did irreparable damage. The Asia Minor Exploration Fund, founded in 1882, supported the classical scholar William Mitchell Ramsay, a good friend of Sayce, in his exploration of Asia Minor during the early 1880s. In the same period, Sayce also tried to encourage Schliemann to excavate the ruins near Boaz Cay in central Anatolia. However, the Smyrna plan ultimately came to nothing. Experts maneuvering by key individuals on the Hellenic Society's Council ensured that a location in Athens was found. The British schools at Athens eventually came into being in 1886. From Sayce's aforementioned manuscript, The Heroic Age of Assyriology, we learn that after 1880, Layard and Sayce continued to meet in London until shortly before Layard's death in 1894. As research currently stands, Anatolia does not emerge as a major topic of conversation between them, whereas it is documented that Sayce and Layard discussed issues relating to Mesopotamia, such as the quarrel in 1893 between Layard's protégé Rassam and the keeper of the British Museum, Wallis Budge. After Layard's death, the unstoppable rise of German Oriental studies, which had begun in those very years when Sayce was traveling in Asia Minor, continued both generally and with regard to Hittite Anatolia. Sayce's rivalry with German Assyriologist Hugo Winkler was first sparked by the cuneiform tablets found in Middle Egypt in 1887 in the ruins by Amarna. Among them, there were 2 letters written in an unknown language, which both Winkler and Sayce independently suggested was Hittite. These and other discoveries then pushed the German and British Orientalists simultaneously in 1905 to ask for permission to dig at Boas Cave. At that time, Ottoman Turkey was by now allied with Germany, especially after the Oriental trip made by the Kaiser in 1898. He visited Constantinople, Jerusalem, Beirut, Damascus, and Baalbek, and foreign observers felt fascinated by this spectacular expedition who marked the personal friendship between the Kaiser and the Sultan. Sayce supported John Garstang of the Institute of Archaeology at Liverpool University, but it was Winkler who succeeded in excavating Boas Cave, where he found the tablets that allowed its identification with the Hittite capital, Hattusa. At this crucial moment in the history of Anatolian studies, many years after Layard's death, Sayce still regretted the ending of Layard's ambassadorship to Turkey, as is clear from a letter now preserved at the Griffith Institute, Oxford, that he sent to Garstang from Egypt on November 10, 1907. From his dahabeah Ishtar, the Nile boat fitted out with a library on which he used to spend the winter, shown here in a drawing by his artist friends, Mrs. Etude Matthews, Sayce wrote, "I wish we had a man like Layard at Constantinople now." Thank you for your attention.
Very much, Silvia, for this very paper. And I think we have a coffee break now. So we will resume at 11:40, and we have a coffee break downstairs. So, thank you.